the goal was mainly to have roundtables. So I'm going to speak fairly briefly on supply chain risk management, and then we're going to get a bunch of smart, and then Craig Casto, who is the global head of RFID, GPS, what else? Auto ID in general, is going to speak for 20 minutes about what they're doing in the area. And then really the goal is to have some folks that are interested in risk management sit around a table and discuss it and see what we can learn from each other. So with no further ado, we'll just get started here. Excuse me? Oh, you got to open them up. Okay. So there we go, and I think we've already done the introduction, and then here's the overview. And you know, I'm not going to say a whole lot, but clearly supply chain risk management is getting a whole lot more attention than it did several years ago. And it may be that we just didn't have the same vocabulary. We talked about supply chain risk management, but we talked about it with different words. But I think in some ways we're certainly seeing a lot more written about it. And I think part of it is because as we've leaned out supply chains, they've become more brittle, and the risks clearly have gotten higher around risk management supply chain. And there are some fundamental steps around supply chain risk management. This is Dell's approach to it, but Dell's approach is similar to pretty much everyone else, right? So what you do is you sit down and you brainstorm with a bunch of people, and you come up with these are all the potential risks that could affect the supply chain. And then there's a step where you sort of sort through them and say, we can't pay attention to everything. Out of these risks that are substantial, which ones should we be paying attention to? And then there's a step of, okay, if these risks are substantial, what do we do about it? What's our strategy to deal with it? What are our triggers? How do we manage those risks? And then there's a continuous learning loop. Now, the thing I find interesting about that process is if you look at the definition and you go to some of the groups that talk about this, the same set of process steps that we've discussed is not only a way to look at risks, it's a way to look at opportunities. So that same process, maybe these are things that could go really wrong, but what are the things that could go really right? And what do we do to capitalize on those things if they occur? I think there's been a lot of growth in thinking around supply chain risk management, and I give a lot of the credit to the Supply Chain Risk Leadership Council. They've got different categories for thinking about risk management in the supply chain area, and I'm not going to go through them one by one, but I would say that if you're not familiar with this council, it's worth getting familiar with them. And the other thing I wanted to say about supply chain risk management is we sometimes have this view that it's very quantitative, that we can put exact probabilities around what's going to happen. And I think what you'll find is that's not always the case. So, what was the exact probability that a tsunami would hit Japan and wipe out factories and key suppliers? I think that would have been very hard to put a number around. But what you can do is have categories of risks, and you can start to ask yourself, okay, this may be hard to quantify, but if it did occur, what would the impact be? And you can get at some of these things subjectively and still say these are worth monitoring and paying attention to. And the other point I want to make is just because we've identified risks doesn't mean that we always have to have plans in place to deal with them. So in Dell's case, when they were speaking last year, they talked about a segmented supply chain. They had products going to the government, and they had the most stringent risk procedures around those products that you could imagine. And then they had very low margin goods aimed at the consumer market, and they had a much higher appetite for risk around those products. And the other thing is, you know, we don't always have to have a plan to transfer risk or hedge risk or avoid risk. In some cases, it may make sense to actually accept the risk. So an example of this is, I talked about the tsunami and how hard it hit Toyota. And Toyota fell out of market leadership. And they fell out of market leadership for about a year and a half. And clearly, you know, they could have had the same kind of supply chain that Honda had. And Honda has manufacturing distributed all around the world, and they have suppliers all around the world, where Toyota was much more focused on producing goods in Japan. So much higher risk profile for Toyota. But can we say Toyota did the wrong thing? And the answer is they're back in market leadership again. Now, I don't know what their strategy is, but they may feel that having R&D close to manufacturing, close to suppliers, all in one area gives them advantages in producing quality products. And who can say that strategy is wrong now that they're back? So in some cases, you may identify risks, and you may say they're major risks. They could be a huge hit to the company, but there's still risks that we're going to take.